From the collected works of Shinran, Chapter 1 of the Tanisho, a record in lament of divergences. Quoting Shinran, alive with the inconceivable working of Amida's vow, I shall realize birth in the Pure Land. The moment you entrust yourself thus to the vow, so that the mind set upon saying the nembutsu arises within you, you are immediately brought to share in the benefit of being alive, grasped by Amida, never to be abandoned. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Well, here I am, here we are, offering or participating in this last experience. Because everything has a beginning and an end. That's the natural flow of life, that things are constantly appearing, disappearing. So that's the sonomama, or life just as it is. So because 11 and a half years ago, I was given the opportunity to be assigned to the Buddhist Church of San Francisco as the resident minister. And with the aging process, I am now eligible to become a retired minister of the Buddhist Churches of America. And so with that opportunity, I'll be vacating this assignment, this position, and to offer some closing reflections as to what these 11 and a half years have meant for me in terms of engaging together in living the nembutsu. And in following my little gimmick that I really developed here at BCSF of using acronyms, I'll be reviewing a few of them for today's reflection. So the story that I'm going to offer begins, as much as, we talk about this idea of being on a journey or a path. And in that context, I think it's natural to feel that we have some kind of goal. There is a destination that somehow we're seeking out to arrive at. Whether it's called birth in the Pure Land or whatever other expression you feel comforted by, encouraged by, that's fine. But to begin today's reflection, I thought I'd review the acronym about the goal of this path. Where are we headed? As far as I appreciate this tradition of Jodo Shinshu, as much as doctrinally or translations and written form, there's talk about birth in the Pure Land. So what does that entail, getting to the other shore? Well, the goal, as I could think of it, is to realize, GOAL, gratitude, openness, acceptance, and liberation. This is how I appreciate the life of nembutsu, the mindfulness of nembutsu, is to awaken to what it means to be grateful for this finite experience of our human life. And within that gratitude, it opens up our hearts and minds to realize all the innumerable causes and conditions that have gone into and continue to make this finite existence possible. At the same time, accepting that it's finite, that we do indeed live a mortal existence. But realizing our mortality is also a sense of liberation, spiritual liberation, to realize how unnecessary or even how foolish it is to try to grasp and cling on to a notion of me, myself, and I that we've encased ourselves in as the proverbial cocoon of delusion. And so the spiritual awakening of Buddhism that I appreciate is this idea of liberation, particularly given our current circumstances, which we continue to refer to as unprecedented. But I don't see that, this pandemic is so-called unprecedented because, historically we read about a century ago, the Spanish flu pandemic and other types of pandemics that have occurred throughout history in various forms. But compounding that, we have here in the Bay Area, the wildfires that were basically started by natural actions of nature, what do you call those lightnings? Those dry lightning shot that triggered those fires. And then we look halfway across the United States and we see the hurricanes that have recently destroyed the southern coast of the United States. And then for decades or for even centuries, we've been in a process of ecological destruction that basically are the result of human ignorance, arrogance, greed. And we unfortunately, recently we observed the 75th anniversary of the atom bombs dropped upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, still crying out, appealing for some sense of sanity, to be able to discontinue the development of these WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, that are all, to me, an expression of mass insanity. To presume that we can develop and control the other by destroying them, or the threat of destruction, is completely contrary to the reality, which I think in a certain way the pandemic is helping us to realize, because we're using that cliche now, or that slogan, we're all in this together. That's a simple, basic way of understanding the Buddhist insight to our interdependency, or we use the term oneness of our life. So to awaken to the truth, not as a belief or a concept, but as a realization of this is how life is. So anything other than that, we are living in a delusion of our permanence and our ability, our power to control, whether it's the environment that we want to exploit, or whether it's the enemy that we're creating these weapons against. And in my sense, that starts the snowball effect. Once you start creating these weapons, you're kind of ready to use them. Sure, some people have a notion that they're deterrents. We'll create stronger weapons than them, and they'll back down. But what does that do? It actually encourages the so-called them to create even more destructive weapons. So that's the downward spiral that we would have hoped that 75 years ago, people, government leaders could have realized. But sadly, that's not the case. Apparently, we have the technical potential to create even more destructive weapons. And we see them constantly on display in various ways, and that's how the different countries, the different governments presume to demonstrate their authority, their power. That's not liberation. That's, and as much as people are complaining about the pandemic restricting their freedom, Buddhism doesn't talk about physical, social freedom. It's talking about freeing our minds, opening our minds to realize, again, the truth of our connection. And so this idea of awakening was the idea of, and I guess this is kind of become my favorite acronym for, we talk about the goal of Buddhism is enlightenment, realization of the truth, becoming Buddha, awakened beings. But then it occurred to me that, well, that's a nice thought, a nice concept. But for me, I realized that the sense of coming alive resonated for me more. And how that came about was I happened to be hearing a talk about this minister named Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman founded a church not far from the BCSF called the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. And I read that he was a mentor to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But anyway, the verse or the saying attributed to Dr. Thurman was, don't ask what people need. Rather ask what makes you come alive. Because what people need are to come alive and go do that. So that kind of inspired me, thinking in terms of what it is to come alive. And so that's the acronym that I think might be amongst the variety. I have a long list of acronyms now, but this might be considered my favorite one. ALIVE. Aware, loving, inspired, valued, engaged. So awareness is just what we call listening to the Dharma. Aware of the Dharma, the reality, the truth of impermanence and interdependence. And from that realization of the Dharma, the sense of love, which is basically connection, where we share the feelings, the joys and sorrows of each other, empathy. And then that becomes the inspiration to be able to have the spirit of life shared with all beings. Because spirit, as I've discussed, is basically an idea of breath, the breath of life. And that's related to the Hawaiian expression aloha. But also in Japanese, we talk about breath in terms of life, because the Japanese word for live is ikiru. And it was interesting to me when I came across the German word for breath is Atman. And I read that Atman came from the Sanskrit, Indian word for being. So in these different cultures, different parts of the world, people had the universal experience of a spirit of life, invisible, formless, colorless, no boundaries. But most significantly for me is that's not what we create. It's not something I can believe, not something I could necessarily comprehend. But undeniably, it is what gives us life, the energy of being. And with that sense of being, SOB, we begin to value this momentary experience that we're sharing together, respecting each other, honoring each other's lives as if they matter, because we indeed matter to each other, because we don't live alone. And that is based upon the sense of being engaged, connected, one with immeasurable life, which is the affirmation of Namo Amida Butsu. So that's the first and last expression of our Shin Buddhist tradition. Namo Amida Butsu is a saying that teaches us that everything we really need in life, we're already receiving. And what makes us Shin Buddhists is to appreciate saying the nembutsu, that truth, that reality, that sense of being. So with that thought, I'll conclude with the final acronym. Aloha. Aloha. So, aloha is, in the popular usage lately, has been expressed as hello, goodbye, a friendly greeting. But from a Shin Buddhist perspective, I would offer that aloha can encourage us to live aloha, which means actively living, open-hearted awareness, actively living open-hearted awareness. And with that, we greet each other, sharing that each moment is both the last and first moment that we're experiencing here and now together in the nembutsu. So, to repeat this kind of adaptation of the translation of the thought of Shinran that began this special text we've been taught to and encouraged to appreciate, that expresses the essential heart, mind of Shinran in very succinct messages. So the first thought that the author of that Tanisho offered was this idea: alive with the inconceivable working of Amida's vow, I shall realize birth in the Pure Land. The moment you entrust yourself thus to the vow, so that the mind set upon saying the nembutsu arises within you, you are immediately brought to share in the benefit of being alive, grasped by Amida, never to be abandoned. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.